Greetings. I'm dr.aldrich, neuropsychologist and psychotherapist in Miami, faculty at Pepperdine University, and the founder of the Center for Neuropsychology and Consciousness. Welcome to the CNC Dialogues. My next guest is Dr. Terry Marks-Tarlow. She received a degree in psychology from Stanford University and a Ph.D. in clinical psychology from UCLA. She is the author of numerous books, my two favorites of which are Psyche's Veil, Psychotherapy, Fractals, and Complexity, and Clinical Intuition in Psychotherapy. She's a research associate at the Institute of Fractal Research in Kassel, Germany, and for over a decade she has been studying interpersonal neurobiology and regulation theory with Allan Schore. She has taught at several institutes, with the most recent one being at Pacifica. She is a well-known psychologist in Los Angeles, teaching workshops and classes to other therapists. In today's discussion, we begin by defining fractals and how they appear in nature and everyday life. We talk about how it can model paradox and even dive into how it may be used to understand synchronicity. We then talk about chaos theory, the limits of linear thinking and certainty, and follow through by defining and discussing the importance of complex systems theory. She then shares a linear and nonlinear interpretation of the famous myth of psyche and eros. We then dive into intuition, discuss what it is and how it differs from impulse. She provides concrete advice on how to awaken intuition and subsequently discusses her next book. As is usual, we end with a series of rapid-fire questions. If you're interested in any of these topics, feel free to skip around. So lots of interesting topics today, and I think I'd like to start by exploring your book, Psyche's Veil.
Okay.
Perhaps not so much as it applies to clinicians. I would like to sort of focus this on the everyday person as well.
Okay.
And there are three core areas that you draw from: fractal geometry, complexity theory, and chaos theory. And I was thinking we could start with fractals. I've been very fascinated by fractals as a mathematical branch that can quantify patterns of nature, describing scale invariance, interdimensionality, self-similarity, whereby the whole is reflected in the parts. Now, in the natural world, I might look at a fern leaf, right, and notice that the overall leaf is sort of reflected in its strands and its strands and so forth. And I guess before moving into more complex ways that fractals can appear in our lives and relationships, could you maybe share with me what some examples are of self-similarity in our inner lives?
Shall I start with nature rather than in our lives?
Okay, maybe nature and then move into the in our lives.
Because one thing that I love to do when I'm teaching is I do this fractal survey of every single scale in the world. So starting with like the micro level, how fractals show up in the patterns of at the micro scale, and then at our scale, they're everywhere if you step outside. And the interesting thing is that this is how nature works. And their fractals are everywhere. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. You step outside and they're in the clouds, they're in the mountainscapes, they're in how the rivers go. And they're pretty much every feature of nature has them. And the only place that we really have straight lines and angles are man-made things. And so we have grown up with the perception that the types of patterning that we're used to, that are reductive, where we pull things apart and this sort of thing, that's actually how nature works, but it isn't how nature works. And so coming to us, the same kind of V pattern that goes into ever smaller self-similar patterns on different scales exist inside our bodies in the shape of our lungs, in the shape of a neuron, in the circulatory system. And so we share these same kind of branching patterns. And the branching pattern is probably the most elementary one for a fractal. And so it makes sense if our brains, the folding of our brains also are fractal. And it makes sense that if our body's physiology is completely filled with fractal shapes, that our mind would follow the same kind of patterning.
Yeah.
And also that we would be really good at recognizing these patterns intuitively and instinctively, which we are. And so everything from how intuition works. When we meet a person, we get a sort of a hit of the whole of that person. Um, and then we flesh out the details later. So this is a very holistic way of being in the world. And then there are ways in which our behavior tends to follow self-similar patterns. So Freud's notion of repetition compulsion, for example, would be a repetition that's never exact. It can't be exact because too many things change in the context and in us. But we tend to repeat. We tend to, all of the ways we get into habits allow us to do self-similar kinds of ways of moving through the world. And then another level of it is the level of epigenetics, which is a brand new study of how our genes wind up either expressing themselves or not expressing themselves. And so some of the patterns of our ancestors wind up repeating in us in self-similar fashion. And so the repetition across generations is there as well.
Right. And just to clarify for the viewers, repetition compulsion, one of the things that that refers to is how early life relationships could possibly be patterned or repeat themselves in patterns in our modern day relationships. Um, and it is fascinating. I know you know this, Terry. I'm just just clarifying for them. But yeah, also I found it interesting how in regards to epigenetics, that's a great example. I didn't even think about that. The intergenerational transmission of how our experiences can modify gene functioning in our present day lives as well as the lives of our progeny. Um, Now, you also mentioned that fractals can also embrace things like paradox and extend through time and space, similar, I guess that goes to epigenetics, and even apply to these sort of symbolic dimensions like we're mentioning now. Um, how do dreams and transference and countertransference relate to?
Mm. Dreams are a fabulous platform for fractals because dreams, there are all these psychoanalytic adages like um, if you can start with a dream and get to the whole of a psyche.
Mm,
So, if you think about dreams as from a holistic point of view, and this is one of the advantages of understanding patterning from a fractal point of view, is that it's holistic rather than reductive.
mm,
And so, if you think of a dream as having, you have access to the entire picture of the psyche,
mm,
then you can sort of start with the dream and go anywhere.
mm,
And not only that, but there are ways that returning to that dream, you bring something new into it, and so you see something different each time that you return to the dream. And so there's a deepening of it in a way that tends to be very nonlinear. So it's not just the dream itself, but it's the interacting with the dream. So that you've got a sort of observer dependent effect of how you look at the dream will determine what you see when you look at the dream. And that's also the same for fractals because the size of the measuring stick you use to measure a fractal will determine the complexity of the edges of it. And fractals complexity tends to be at the edges. And this is the greatest paradox of all, in that the smaller your measuring stick, the larger the measurement. And that is very different than trying to measure, let's say, the length of a table.
mm,
Because when you measure the length of a table, no matter what size measuring stick you use, you get the same length every time.
mm,
But the paradox that a measuring stick that is infinitely small will lead to a measurement that's infinitely large
mm,
is quite paradoxical. But that kind of paradox is very, very much like the paradox of complexity in people,
mm,
in that the closer you look at someone, the more you see.
Mm-hmm.
And so that has the same paradoxical feeling to it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. There's another topic I think would be interesting for us to delve into. I approach this with a little bit of trepidation, but I do so because I know if there are academics listening to this, they may be skeptical, but perhaps you can reduce their skepticism. In any case, what I'm talking about is synchronicity. You know, people find immense truth in these, and shall we say, these uncanny events, right, in life. Now, it as an acausal connecting principle, right,
Right.
where there is a coincidence in time of two or more causally unrelated events,
Mhm,
and but with of course similar meaning or the same meaning.
mhm,
Now for you, I think you call this an inter-objective event, right? So, and
mhm.
also you could say there's a fifth dimension that's posited to be sort of existing there, the dimension of meaning. And I know you've posited before imagination could be a fifth dimension. So yeah, could you elaborate and maybe connect some of those things that I've asked?
Or many people in Einstein's day said the fourth dimension was either time, but also could be imagination. But yes, synchronicity is definitely something that intrigues me, partly because it happens to me all the time.
Mm,
And the more it happens to me, and the more I appear on podcasts that highlight synchronicity, really the more it happens, and it's happening to people around me. I just had an extraordinary synchronicity with a new patient.
mm,
It was like a triple synchronicity, which was really cool. But yeah, I have used fractals to model synchronicity because fractal boundaries are open. And the way that we tend to think of boundaries, especially in society today, is you setting boundaries, and you set them to expel toxic people from your lives, and they're just sort of these straight lines, and you're either in or out,
mm,
and society is getting more polarized. But in nature, the edges of fractals tend to occur where different forces or planes are coming together, and there's an open exchange across those boundaries. And so, if you look at boundaries between mind and body, or body and world, and you think of them as fractal and open in this way, then self-similar pattern can model outside and inside.
mm,
And really, that's what synchronicity does, is that meaning becomes the connecting force between the world outside and the world inside.
mm,
And of course, our imaginations are always kind of modeling the outside world anyway, and so it's not that far fetched to um, to think that the inside world and the outside world could have similar patterning to one another. I can tell the story if you want of this new patient.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, it sounds like it'd be really good to hear. I just wanted to chime in though. I had a
Sure.
patient that used to call synchronistic events God winks. I always thought that was
God winks.
God winks. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
I always thought that was very clever. Um,
That is, and I think that that spiritual feeling about it
mm,
is very, very common, because when it happens, we get a taste of that holistic interconnection between everything,
mhm.
and that's what many people refer to as God. So I like that term a lot.
Excellent.
Um,
Mm,
Jung said that synchronicity tends to happen when people are stuck
mm,
and stuck on the inside, and then they need the universe to come hit them over the head in order to get them unstuck,
mm,
which actually does apply to this case, if you know, as an example. But Deepak Chopra had a different perspective on synchronicity. His perspective is the higher one's state of consciousness, the greater the access to synchronicity.
mm,
Um, because one has a better sense of the whole of things, and so it's a sign of higher states of consciousness to him. I think it's both. I think it can happen for either reason, and that the more we tune into it, the more it does tend to happen.
Mhm.
I think the original episode between Freud and Jung was when they were arguing with one another over the nature of the unconscious, and right in the moment of that, like something flew off the
Yeah,
bookshelf,
bookshelf, right.
right? And it's almost exactly what happened with this new patient. So, just very briefly, I used to do a lot of work clinically with people who flunk licensing exams, and I haven't done it in many years. But this person came to me having flunked a licensing exam 6 different times. And I told her I once saw someone who'd flunked the bar 9 times and passed after we did the work, and that the difference in how I treat that kind of work and other people is that I don't think it's about when people have done it, have flunked multiple times, really close to the line. Something else is going on in their unconscious, and it's an unconscious block. It's not a skill deficit. And so I told this woman, I asked her how she was studying, and we looked at what some of the blocks could be. And every example that I gave as a possibility, she resonated to, which was amazing. There were 3 different ways in which she felt she might have been blocked. But the other thing I did was tell her to put away her books, put away her flashcards. She had been lugging like all these heavy books around, and to study using practice tests only, because in terms of skill, if you can pass on the practice test, you'll pass, and that's a good way to see what you don't know. So she, at the end of the session, apparently put all her books on the bookshelf, and 5 minutes later, the whole thing collapsed.
Wow.
And all of the books were on the floor. And she sent me a picture. She left them there for a couple of days because it was so symbolic to her that she had been burdened by this heavy load that was unnecessary, that was really difficult to bear. And so that was the first synchronicity. There were 2 more that followed the next session between us, which was kind of crazy. That the subject that she's studying midwifery,
Mm.
and I happened, prior to her contacting me, to be reading a book by Lisa C. About ancient China in the 15th century and midwives in the 15th century. So that's pretty crazy that was happening. And then when I told her she might like the book, she said, they just asked me for book recommendations in my little circle of midwives. And I said I didn't have any because they didn't, I just haven't really liked any of the books. So I gave her that book recommendation. So it was sort of interesting that the same person that it happened to once,
Mhm.
it kept happening with.
Right, right.
Yeah. And
And
in similar fashion, really.
and to address some people who may be skeptical, how do you distinguish between something of a chance event versus one that is synchronistic?
Mm. Well, I think that's a matter of belief, and
Mm.
I don't really believe in. I don't believe in chance per se. I mean, from my perspective, everything is deeply interconnected, and so I really think it kind of depends on it. People can be nihilistic and say nothing is meaningful, and
Mhm.
they, even if they're getting hit in the face with all kinds of coincidences. But I think it's the kind of thing you either have to experience and in an embodied way have a feeling of this means something to me, um, or not.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right. Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing your opinion on that.
Sure.
Um, now, I think that it'd be interesting for us to dive into chaos theory, if that works for you. Um,
Okay, and actually, I can give you a mathematical proof
okay.
of the irrelevance of chance, in a sense.
Mm,
So, one of the founders of chaos theory, or one of the luminaries in chaos theory, was a guy named Michael Barnsley, and he invented a game called the chaos game.
mm,
And it's better to have visuals with fractals and with chaos and stuff, but I'll try to describe it. Um, the game is, you start with a triangle,
mhm,
and you start anywhere you want on the triangle. You throw a six-sided die, and um, and so two of the sides, or we'll say a three-sided die is easier. If you throw a three-sided die, which is impossible, that's why it's a six-sided die, and whatever it lands on, the vertex it lands on, you go to that corner and halfway back. Then you
mm,
throw it again to the corner, halfway back, and you mark each of those points. Now, from the description of that, would you not say that should be random? That should just look like a pile of random dots, right?
mm.
Wouldn't it? I mean, you're
Right.
throwing die and you're moving according to the die,
Right. Yeah.
right? But when you do that infinite, we'll say infinite number of times,
Hmm.
what you come out with is a thing called the Sierpinski triangle. You come out with one of the most famous fractal shapes that is highly ordered.
Hmm.
And so I think in Psyche's Veil,
Mm,
I look at that as a metaphor for fate being sort of the fractal residue of chance.
mm. Is it also, as you might have described, a hidden order that
That's
underlies
right.
chaos?
That's right. And
Mm,
so, looking at chaos theory, um, the underlying attractor
mhm,
that Lorenz discovered that initially applied to the weather,
mhm,
and the unpredictability of the weather, has this hidden order of, it's got a fractal attractor, and pretty
mm,
much all, if most, if not all, chaotic processes in nature also have an underlying hidden mathematical order in fractals.
right.
So the kind of
Mm,
fractals we see with our eyes
mm,
um, is that's like a physical fractal, but this mathematical order under chaos is pretty profound.
mhm,
And for us as either lay people or as therapists or interested in psychology, one of the takeaways, probably the most important takeaway of chaos theory, is we can model a system perfectly. We can understand its order perfectly, but it doesn't mean we can predict its future,
mm. Okay.
especially the long term future.
Right.
And I think the healthy stance in clinically and in life is not to try. I think the more we try to, one of the paradoxes is the more we try to grasp onto certainty, the
Mhm.
more uncertain we feel and the more anxious we feel.
Right. It makes me think about chaos theory as an approach that really examines the edges or the limits of certainty and
Oh,
linearity.
that's right.
And
And
yeah,
predictability.
so I wanted to explore this a little bit with you and ask you first of all, what are some of these limits of linearity and certainty, and secondly, how does chaos theory pick up on those edges?
Mm. Well, I mean, I think that the big three are the ones you're mentioning. That certainty, we can never be in. Certainty is an illusion.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Complete certainty. I mean, even in mathematics, the work of Gödel, sort of took down of all the sciences, mathematics is the one that is the most um, possible in having complete certainty. An equation is either true or false.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And so there was in the 20th century, there was this big attempt to use mathematics to establish absolute certainty.
Hmm.
And Gödel just proved it wasn't possible using a very recursive, fractal-like method of correspondences. And so, even in mathematics, there are these paradoxes that come up when you start with the metaphor of number, for example. And different ways of conceiving number, and then whole branches of mathematics based on that, that then clash with one another in certain ways. And so um, certainty is an illusion. Predictability, those are the edges. You can predict in the short term to some degree, but really these are things that evolutionarily um, became. I want to say actually that the traditional logic that it has been in place since Aristotle's time, the exclusion of the middle and all of this stuff where things are either true or false, um, is a property of left brain thinking.
Mm.
And that I've developed an epistemology that out of the principles of fractal geometry that include things like paradox and ambiguity and just some of the different features that we're talking about here that I first started to notice in Psyche's Veil, but then have kind of elevated to a different epistemology, a different way of doing logic that's more consistent with how the right brain operates
Mm.
and how the unconscious operates and how our emotions operate, which are very nonlinear.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, I wanted to ask one question before actually moving into complex systems, which I think is going to draw more conversation about what we're talking about now.
Mm-hmm.
Before it leaves my mind, when we mentioned chaos and the hidden order, you mentioned attractors, and I
Mm-hmm.
know in the book you specified strange attractors, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are attractors exactly, and maybe you could just help me better understand what are strange
Sure.
attractors? Yeah.
Yeah, so an attractor, this is in nonlinear dynamics, and you could say nonlinear dynamics may be the sort of broadest theoretical container for a lot of these things.
Mm.
And the an attractor is simply the end state of a system.
Mm.
And so if you take a marble and you roll it around the side of a bowl,
Mhm.
it'll eventually wind up in a still place at the bottom of the bowl.
Mhm.
And so that's a point attractor. And the bowl and the trajectory it takes, or the path it takes to get to the bottom of the bowl, is the basin of attraction. So every system is going to go through a whole bunch of states before it either winds up still somewhere, that would be a point attractor, or it may oscillate between two different states. That
Mhm.
would be a cyclical attractor.
Okay.
So a light switch is either sometimes it's on, sometimes it's off. That would be a cyclic attractor, though it could be 3 states or 4 states. But if it cycles through states, it's cyclical, and it's
Mhm.
still kind of in the linear realm. Then you get into some sort of quasi linear attractors like a torus attractor, which is, if you imagine a donut,
Mm.
and the linear part is the round part, and the nonlinear part is the wrapping of the donut. So it keeps going around, it never overlaps itself. And
Mhm.
so that one is a semi chaotic attractor. And then the kind we were talking about underneath um, chaotic systems is a fully strange attractor or chaotic attractor. And that means it never reaches an end state. It just keeps
Mhm.
going. It just keeps bouncing around into new places, and they are always new.
Mhm.
Um, Even though our minds like to sort of collapse into simplicity as if we're facing sameness, as if we see sameness, and as if there is sameness all around us. But it's actually an illusion that maybe helps us evolutionarily to
Yeah.
survive and, to and this I think has been pointed out for many centuries by mystics, etc., that the sort of the nature of reality appears to be different than the nature of our how things look to our consciousness, because our consciousness has evolved to our everyday consciousness anyway has evolved to survive, not to perceive the fundamental nature of things.
Yeah, I think that's very well founded in the perception sciences. Sciences, especially how, for example, the spectrum of light that we see is definitely tailored for our survival needs. And the work of Donald Hoffman, if you've seen some of that, he's come up with all sorts of really interesting mathematical equations to basically suggest that the reality that we see is not real at all. It's not even 1% real.
No,
That's
I'm not familiar with
okay.
his
Well, you
work.
should
Yeah.
check out that episode, Terry. I think you would like it.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, just briefly, he basically simulated a whole bunch of games using evolutionary game theory, and all these simulated life forms either saw reality as it was, or they didn't see reality at all and only saw what suited their survival. And over again, all the ones that saw the truth of reality perished, whereas the ones that saw only what suited their survival survived.
Well, is that not unlike the mystic who is not the householder and doesn't have a spouse and doesn't make children, but just sort of contemplates the nature of the universe? Civilization would die if everyone did that.
Right.
And
Um,
you wouldn't eat, and which is part of where, sort of
yeah.
psychedelics kind of come in too.
Right. Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, part of the idea, right, is that there's just way too much information for us to process given what we're capable of doing
exactly,
in time.
exactly.
And it is a really interesting intersection in time, though, given that we've reached the point technologically as well as at least in the Western world, some degree of comfort to the extent that we can begin exploring truth at a much deeper level than we did before.
Mhm.
Um, but I'd like us to transition into complex theory. And when it comes to complex systems theory, in practice, we could think of it as a dynamic system, as a moving system composed of a set of many, we could say, interconnected elements that evolve over time, that self-organize, right, into higher order units, and it has many characteristics to it. There's no way I can go over everything at once. I'm just kind of setting it up for those watching. But one thing that we can say, for example, something that we've mentioned a few times at this point is that it's nonlinear, right? That there can be this disproportionate input to output ratio. There are emergent properties. So basic math, right? 1 plus 1 doesn't equal 2. 1 plus 1 can equal 3. Something greater can be produced than what's just merely added. We have the self-organizing component, meaning that it can organize itself. Higher properties, order properties can change the lower order and vice versa.
Mhm.
And so I think that's a decent snapshot. Um, well, could
Nice
you share?
job. Nice job.
Yes. Could you share a little bit more about complexity theory or complex systems theory and its application to life?
Yeah, I think the most important application comes in the distinction between health and what's healthy and what's not healthy.
Hmm.
Because from a linear point of view, for a long time, we have said that what's healthy is what's stable and what's ordered.
Hmm.
And um, it turns out that that's actually very unhealthy in its extreme,
Hmm.
that every physiological system, and take, for example, before I go on to a different model, a complexity model, let's take one of the most successful psychological tests, the MMPI. Um, it's like it's healthy if you're flatlining, if you've got like zero symptoms and everything is stable and looks like a line. But it turns out that actually all physiological systems, and I think that psychological systems also, need a little bit of chaos
Mhm.
injected into them, so that they need enough stability for structure, for communication, but they need enough instability for creativity, for change, and so even things like our hearts, if our heartbeat is perfectly stable and regular,
Mhm.
it's very, very unhealthy. It needs a little bit of variability, a little bit of chaos. Every system in the body works that way. How
Mhm.
we walk, um, our breathing, our everything. And psychologically, I mean, think about relationships too. If you have a relationship that is completely predictable and unchanging,
Mhm.
it's stagnant, it's dead. You want to have some amount of novelty all the time, some an emergent novelty, as what you're talking about, where something arises, especially like Winnicott would say, in the space between people where you get together and we don't, like, I didn't know what we were going to talk about when we started. And hopefully the way we're talking to each other allows these ideas to emerge in a way that is interesting to anybody listening. If it was scripted, it would feel dead and stagnant. So
Mhm.
I think that's one of the most important ways that complexity
Right.
theory really applies, and it's much more in line in terms of health. Much more in line, for example, with Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine as well, than this sort of Western medical model where there's this fixed sequence where that you first you look at a system and you diagnose, and then you prescribe, and then you check it out.
Mhm.
But let's talk about psychology, where the more complex a case, the more I find as a clinician, and I've been in practice since '85, the more that diagnosis actually emerges from the interaction. It doesn't precede it.
Mhm.
And there isn't a fixed prescription either. It's a living relational process where both the sense of what's going on and the sense of where one can go emerge out of being together, and the process don't precede it and can't be predicted,
Mhm. Mhm.
at
Yeah, no,
least for deep change anyway.
yeah.
Yeah,
I, I think it's really important what you mentioned there about this idea of a life that's too stable or static ended up being too rigid, and that can also be leading to conditions. Or the exact opposite would be too much chaos is also not good, but
right,
the right amount of sort of chaos injected in there can lead to complexity.
right.
Now, would you say that this is? It came to mind as you're talking about uh, the the integration of chaos into systems. It came to mind as the Jungian archetype of the trickster.
That's mine.
Okay.
That's my archetype. I think that's as a clinician.
Hmm.
Okay, and here's a strange synchronicity, multi generational synchronicity. So, yes, the trickster is absolutely the archetype for, unpredictable change. But for me, as I've always thought of myself as a trickster,
Mm.
my dad was a puer aeternus, an eternal
Oh,
child, and that sort of fits with the trickster thing.
mhm.
But I have 0666 three generationally in my family.
Mm.
So my dad worked at 666 Fifth Avenue, which is the Kushner building.
Mm.
Um, My son's social ends in 0666, and our landline, where I live in Topanga for 20 years or more, ended in 0666.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Interesting.
all by chance. Okay, is that coincidence? Like three different generations there. Um, doesn't feel like it to me, but I'm sure many people watching this will say, yeah, that's just chance.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what matters more from a pragmatic perspective is how does it fit into your life, and does it make it more meaningful or
Right,
productive in some way or
right.
not? Um,
Yeah, but
so
I love being a trickster as a therapist because,
right.
being able to disrupt a system.
Mhm.
Sometimes you have to disrupt a system that is too
Absolutely.
stable or too rigid,
Hmm.
um, and there are many ways to do it.
Hmm.
Um, a koan,
Zen.
in Zen Buddhism is sort of like a trickster
Hmm.
um, product,
Right.
if you will. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, it's great. I think it's wonderful and painstaking sometimes when the trickster is involved in your own life and your own systems get disrupted. You put so much effort into something, and all of a sudden it gets upended by a simple fact or something else, and you
Right.
can't help but laugh at it sometimes and realize that although it's unfortunate, at the same time it does lead you towards increased complexity, actually, and potentially accuracy and flexibility and openness, of course, that must come along with it.
Exactly. Flexibility and openness are the key ingredients of a healthy system, and being able to laugh at ourselves instead of taking everything so seriously, I
Hmm.
think is part of that, because it becomes safer then to undergo change.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Um, so, I brought up the Trickster. I'm also interested, actually, and I want to move to another book of yours right after this question. But
Okay.
you talk about psyche and eros. And I was wondering if you could provide a condensed version of that sort of myth and what the linear interpretation is and what the nonlinear interpretation is. Just, I think it's a nice contrast.
Yeah. So, that this is it's actually that myth, that Greek myth, is the origins of the term psychology. So everything sort of pours out of
Hmm.
it historically. Um, but it's so the myth is that psyche is the woman and eros is the man, and in the myth they um, in order for them to come together, they get separated very early, and Eros's mother is a very jealous woman, and Psyche was considered the most beautiful in the land. And so the mother did not want her son to be with this gorgeous woman, and so she was banished, and after they were together, she was banished and had to undergo these very painful tasks in order to come back together with Eros. And the tasks are interpreted in more traditional terms, I would say, in psychology, as women need, as in terms of feminine psychology, that women need to sort of be able to stand on their own 2 feet. They need to do some of the things that men historically do or stereotypically do, like be discriminating. So the first task is she's in a room and there are all these seeds thrown together, and she has to sort them into piles, which is a very linear reductive thing. But actually, I should stay with the traditional one first. So all of the tasks involve difficulty, and she tries to kill herself many times in it because it's so tough. But eventually she succeeds in all of the tasks, and she winds up in a marriage with Eros. And so, again, the traditional interpretation is women need to be able to stand on their own. They need to be able to say no. They need to be discriminating, etc., before they can say yes and really join successfully in marriage.
Mm.
That's a number of psychologists have written about feminine psychology connected to it. So I reinterpreted the myth in terms of the two hemispheres of the brain, and where psyche is corresponds to the right brain, and eros corresponds to the left brain, and it kind of follows more of a yin yang sort of thing, that there are masculine and feminine properties in the universe,
Mm.
and that the yin factor or the feminine factor is the earthly one, and when she's trying to kill herself in this sort of thing, and that the male factor is more like the sun um, and the spirit and in the sky. And so according to this, the different tasks that psyche has to do, there are all these fractal elements, and there are all these ways in which the animals help her, that all these helpers come from the ground. And so this is like a holistic way of understanding how when we're close to nature, we're closer to the sort of the fractal um, side of things. And in psychology, often instincts are interpreted, like in dreams and this sort of thing. Animals or insects are thought of as being the instincts, and so this is sort of closer to nature. So yeah, so I think it's kind of the marriage between the left and right hemisphere that is inside of each of us, rather than only feminine versus masculine psychology.
Excellent. And when I think of nature expressing itself through humans, I can't help but think of intuition. And intuition, I know, is something of grave importance to you as well. And first of all, I wanted to, for the audience, I was wondering if you could first distinguish between intuition and an impulse. Uh, let's start with that, actually.
That's a harder one to start with than the difference between, say, determination and
Right, well, that one's a little more, people have
yeah.
talked about that a little more. This is the stuff that I think some people may have some more difficulties with.
Right. So, intuition, I would say, is uh, a grounded sensibility
Mm,
that is able to um, perceive the complexity of context, and just the full complexity of things, whereas impulse is um, being driven from the inside by urgency that often ignores the full complexity of things and
mm,
just pushes people in directions that, if they were to slow down and be more thoughtful about it, they may not want to go into.
mm,
And for clinicians, it's really important to make distinctions between intuition and impulse, because we can do great damage when we're sitting with people if we act by impulse instead of by intuition. And
mhm,
always, if we're acting by intuition, which I believe every clinician does in the heat of the moment, um, it's important not to be too attached to certainty,
mhm,
that we can't know that our intuition is right. We
mhm,
have to check that out. We need feedback. We need to check it out with the people that if we're working clinically, we need other sources of feedback in other places. But even in science, intuition is always part of the process because it starts the experiment going.
Right. Yeah. I think it's so important to highlight something that you said there, that impulse ignores the context, ignores the complexity, whereas intuition takes it into consideration. When we think about so many of the theories out there, like the somatic marker hypothesis or dual processing theory or the predictive processing theory, all of these theories, they all involve the idea that there are convergent zones within the brain that's receiving information from many different areas. And these areas are active when we are making decisions that are related to what we traditionally would call intuition. To bridge this to things that we've talked about before, would you say that intuition is a nonlinear process that's mostly non-conscious and rapid, and that integrates somatic, emotional, and cognitive information?
Hmm. Absolutely, and it's emergent too.
Right.
It's not something we don't know where it comes from. In fact,
Right.
intuition is a great place to really have a somatic feeling for what emergence is, because it just appears. It appears whole, and we can't know how we got there. Although we can check out whether it's accurate or not
Hmm.
down the line. So
Hmm.
yes, it's nonlinear, it's emergent, it's self-organizing. It moves in a bottom-up fashion.
Hmm.
In the sense of it goes from the body or from the unconscious up to the mind versus conscious deliberation, which is more top down in the sense of going from the mind to the body. And that kind of deliberation, rational thought is much more linear.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Wonderful.
Hmm.
Now, I was wondering, since you did write a book on intuition, what did you find in the science? Are there times when it's more beneficial versus disadvantageous versus times where it's the opposite?
You know, I take the stand that we all use intuition to bridge the gap between theory and practice. That
Mhm.
essentially, when we're in the room with people, we're using our intuition, even if we think we're using a formulaic approach. And so I think it's really important to recognize that we're winging it to some degree all the time and need to in order to make full contact with uh, the people that we're working with.
Mhm.
Um, but different theoretical orientations and different intentions in therapy use different degrees of intuition. And I would say that the kind of work I do, which is I tend to see people for a long time because they want to have deep transformation,
Mhm.
and that in doing that kind of work, it's essential to hone intuition, but it's difficult and to teach it because it's going to look different in each person. Everybody has a different way of expressing their intuition, and so training programs really need to go at it indirectly rather than directly. And unfortunately, all too few of them don't even talk about it. So
Mhm.
um, even though we're all using it. Just like, fractals are all out there to be seen, but if we don't talk about them and don't make it apparent, we don't recognize that we're seeing them, even though they're quite intuitive to see.
Mhm.
So uh, I really think that intuition has been undervalued because people it's associated with misogyny, like it's women's realm, and dismissed, or that it's not scientific. But now we have different tools that make it a lot easier to actually measure intuition because things like hyperscanning, which involve simultaneous measurement, either physiologically or in the brain between two people interacting.
Mhm.
We can start to hone in on these things that are otherwise invisible.
Mhm. Yeah. So, would you have any recommendations for somebody that wants to be more in touch with their intuition? How might they awaken their intuition?
Well, that's the name of the one of my books. The companion book is Awakening Clinical Intuition. Um, but I think if somebody wants to be more in touch with their intuition, they should silence their mind as much as possible, because conscious thought, if you're continually thinking, you're going to be blocking your intuition, um, because it's tends to be non-verbal in nature, not verbal in nature, and it tends to be more sensory and emotionally driven, and so getting more in touch with your body and letting your body be more in touch with the world in a sensory sort of way is one path in. Doing any kind of art is another way in. Anything that is going to connect you more to your body is going to help with intuition, because the unconscious lives in the body, not
Mm,
in the head.
mm,
Um, and so uh, those are good ways. And of course, you could always buy my Awakening Clinical Intuition, which has a lot of scripts in it and a lot of different questionnaires and things to fill in that kind of help um, uh, elevate awareness of these dimensions, which is always important too. So.
mm. Yeah, it is. It is interesting to point out. When you mention to silence your mind, the excessive chattering makes it difficult for you to receive information from other parts of yourself. It's like
Absolutely.
it's like when you're talking, it's too hard to listen to what another person might be saying or thinking.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, a really good example of that. I do, these days, I do a lot of ballet, and I'm doing it 4 days a week, and I really love it. And when I first started doing ballet, I was an adult, not a kid. When kids start, they don't have anything going on in their heads. They're not thinking. They're just sculpting their bodies. But when adults start, it's not so easy. And when I first started, I was definitely talking, move this part, move that part, straighten this part, straighten that part. And I was I did not look graceful, to say the least. Especially because I was coming from being a rock climber, and
Mm,
um, I just different. Anyway, my parts were not going together. They weren't. It was not. There was no holistic feel to it. And at a certain point in time, I don't know, maybe 7 years ago or something like that, I completely shut off my head, completely, and learned that I can memorize what's happening with my body, not with my head.
mm,
And I had this synesthetic breakthrough
mm,
where I started singing the music, and in the classes I take, it's live piano music, which is fabulous. I started singing the music with my body, and
mm,
all of a sudden, I began to discover what gracefulness, or what grace is in ballet. I
right.
think grace is different in a moral sense or in a spiritual sense, but there was this incredible feeling of my whole body working together to
Mm,
express this one thing, is the sound of the music.
mm.
Um,
Perhaps the physiological grace is a self-similar fractal to spiritual grace and other forms of grace.
Maybe so. Maybe so.
Mm,
I definitely am interested in both kinds,
mm,
and but for me, that was such a intense learning moment about how the chatter in the head blocks certainly blocks being graceful.
Mm. So I'm a musician on the side. So I play guitar and I sing and I played lots of shows. And every time I remember that I would get into my own head, and lose the flow. That's when I lose the flow, really, and that's when I'd get detached and I'd mess up a chord or I'd play a wrong note, and that would just, um, I always recover quickly, so no one would notice except for myself. But nonetheless, you notice it, and it can be like, oh no, I can't believe that just happened. But it's so fascinating how our minds can interrupt the flow of things. Um, so
Absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely, and I think music is a really good example, especially when you're playing with other people.
hmm
Um, yeah, there's this story that if you're in a really heated tennis match with someone, the best way to throw your opponent off guard is to compliment their serve.
it's a good one.
Yeah, right. Because
Yeah,
suddenly they become consciously aware of what they're doing, and that's the best way to throw them off.
interesting. Maybe there's another book to be written here: tactics, psychological tactics.
Well, right. The Zen of motorcycle, the Zen of archery, all those books I think are very much along those lines in the sense of in order to be one with whatever you're doing, you
Right.
can't be thinking, you can't be talking to yourself.
hmm Yeah, and the interesting counterintuitive part is that some people who are very intellectual will think that, well, no, if I think, that should assist me in my performance. But there's so many cases where not thinking ends up outperforming, those sorts of instances. And so, really interesting stuff. The other part I will throw in there, because I recently did a sort of review of the literature looking at studies looking at intuition and versus analytical abilities. Sorry.
Mhm,
And what
mhm.
we end up finding is that when problems are simple and linear, and they have a clear path and the variables are clearly involved, analytical thinking wins out. But when it's unpredictable and complex, intuition almost always wins out. It's
Right,
pretty interesting.
right.
That yeah.
Yeah, when I wrote the Clinical Intuition and Psychotherapy book,
Mhm.
which came out in 2012, at that point, when I tried to do a literature search, or when I did a literature search, the main research was in emergency nursing.
Hmm. I think I saw that paper also.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, because it's the same kind of thing. When
Mm,
things are unpredictable, um, in an emergency kind of conditions where you have to make a quick decision,
mm.
that's where intuition serves the best.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Now, you're also working on a new book. Talk about all the books that you've written with, if I might pronounce this wrong, but Leanne
Domash, uh-huh, yeah,
Domash. So, okay.
yeah.
So,
So,
yeah, go ahead.
well, Leanne and I, when we met, we felt like we were twins because although she lives in New York City and I live in Los Angeles, we both are practitioners of many, many years who specialize in creativity. And something we resonated so strongly when we met. And that was a point, too, that was very exciting for me because one of my very nonlinear adventures has been being invited by a composer at Juilliard to write the librettos for his operas. And he puts fractals in his music, and he wanted someone who could put fractals in the words. And I figured out a way to do that. And so I was in New York City for the opening of an opera at Lincoln Center, which is extremely exciting. And Leanne and I met and we really clicked. And so the first thing that happened is she invited me to do a graphic novel. So we did um, a book called The Eel and the Blowfish, which is about trauma and recovery. And specifically, it's about incest and recovery, and because incest is incredibly common but hardly ever talked about, and tends to be one of these epigenetically transmitted multi-generational patterns.
Mm.
Almost every case that I've had of incest has involved other generations of incest too.
Mm.
Anyway, so we finished that book. And it was so much fun to work together that we had to do another book. And so we are almost done with a new book. And this, so the graphic novel was for the general public, and that was really the first book I've ever done that is for the general public.
Mm.
And the book that we're working on now is also for the general public. And it's called Reimagining Boundaries.
Mm.
And so we're using fractal, we're using how nature patterns to look at boundaries, all kinds of boundaries psychologically, and the notion of interpenetrating boundaries is the notion that each side is on the other side, kind of like a yin yang symbol,
Mm.
where there's a bit of one side in the other, and but there are many fractal boundaries completely interpenetrating, where the sides are completely mixed together. And so we're looking at the full range of boundaries that are the kind that we talk about, we're toxic boundaries, and you have to, get the person out. But
Mm.
the sort of disease of modern times of so much mistrust and so much polarization, us and them, and in group, out group, and so we're looking at how this notion of interpenetration can be not just healthy, because psychologically we often have both sides of the paradox. We have sadness and joy. We have things that they go together and they make for each other, and that not just healthy, but often spiritually elevating to feel this kind of interpenetrating boundary, because it's a way to feel one with nature. And if we have more of that kind of feeling, it'll be easier to take care of nature, instead of separating ourselves and then plundering her resources and this sort of thing. And it becomes easier to have empathy for differences in people too. And so we're trying to have a very innovative format where there's a lot of art in it, because visuals often speak more complexly than words can.
Mm-hmm.
There's poetry, there are little mini myths, there are clinical stories, there are personal stories, and we're looking at a range of polarities moving through self relations, or what we're calling I me, self other relations, or I thou, and then self world relations, or I universe. And so going up that ladder and looking at boundaries from all different points of view.
That's really quite interesting. Looking at boundaries to gain a deeper understanding of oneself and one's relationship with the world and others, and by that awareness, be then capable of potentially, we can say, penetrating or passing through some of the difficulties that come with them.
Mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm.
Sounds like a very creative and productive and fun project to be working on.
Yeah, we're having such a great time, and we're almost done and very excited about how it's turning out. So thank you for bringing it up and asking about it.
Mhm.
And we, we're sort of looking at it as a way of embodying a kind of psychological activism,
Mm.
meaning sort of being able to transform ourselves first helps then with the larger global problems. And so we've coined this phrase, Leanne actually coined the phrase psychological activism, and and we're we're trying to. It's kind of a call to internal action
Mm,
as a precursor to external action.
hmm. Yeah. Well, I think the interesting thing is it's the saying, right? That the first step in avoiding a problem is being aware of what it is, and perhaps drawing one's attention to boundaries is it's a different way of bringing up some of the issues that people may be facing.
Exactly. It's sort of like a way of cross-cutting through anything, in a way that's different from like the social politics of
Mhm.
today,
Yeah.
because a lot of boundary talk is political or the social politics, and this is more aligned with nature across the board, and so it feels like a sideways cut into some of these problems that maybe can help avoid um, like the automatic responses that certain words will have, and
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, definitely looking forward to that book. Looking
Thank
forward to
you
that
so
book.
much.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so at this point, we have a series of rapid fire questions, which is traditional for for this podcast that I've set up. Um, so if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you questions, and if you could give me quick responses, that would be just wonderful. Okay?
Is this just like a free association kind of thing?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so you'll like this process. Okay, name a book you love.
The one I'm reading, the Lady Tan and the Circle of Women. I'm loving this book, and everything by Lisa C.
Okay, name a source of inspiration.
Nature.
Okay, and what did you want to be when you were a child?
An eternal child.
Okay, just like
I
that.
didn't have I didn't have a vision. It kind of emerged.
Okay, okay.
I
How
wanted
about?
to play though. I wanted to have a lifelong of play and flow.
Well, I'm sure you found that in your current profession. I know I have.
Mhm.
Favorite type of music?
What kind of music did you
Yeah,
say?
favorite type of music. What's your favorite type of music?
Right now, Bach Preludes and Fugues, which I am laboring at and terrible at the piano, but I spend many hours making my way through them.
Okay,
And they're very fractal.
I bet. What's something unique about yourself? Or something lots of people don't know?
Ooh, I want to say everything is pretty unique about me. Uh, Maybe that I spend most of my days in flow.
Hmm, okay. Do you believe in God?
Not in the traditional kind of separation between God and humans, but I do have a deeply spiritual felt sense of the interconnection of the whole, and I see that as God.
Okay, so would you say it's like pantheist versus pantheistic or panentheistic?
Um, yeah, I do think that there is both a material and a non-material or a mind or consciousness side to everything all the way down.
Okay.
Um, but I'm not an idealist. A lot of the consciousness folks see consciousness coming first, but I sort of see it like turtles all the way down, that it's both and.
Okay, so more of a, a pan experientialist, perhaps, or a pan psychic.
Okay, yeah, like you're making up some terms.
Well, I mean, it's white. It's from Alfred North Whitehead was pan
Oh, okay,
experientialist. I think someone
okay,
called him that, but he talked about how matter and mind are like a dipolarity, that they're
yeah,
two.
all the way down.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm of the same mind there. And you answered my subsequent question, which was if consciousness or matter was more fundamental.
Right. I think it goes all the way down.
Right.
Um, and I think the quantum level, that in some of the more recent writings that I've been doing of modeling
Hmm.
things like synchronicity or non-local forms of consciousness, I think that I like Bohm's model of the quantum implicate level, where everything is one thing, and I think we sort of tap into that, and then have a fractal kind of cascading up of pattern from there.
Interesting. So a sort of non-differentiated level of
Hmm.
experience. Okay.
Exactly.
Right.
Hmm.
And
Of potential.
a
Yeah.
potential. Right.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, do you believe our universe is meaningful or meaningless, or both?
What do you think? Meaningful.
Okay.
Meaningful.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Favorite philosopher, if you have one?
um, I'm really liking McGilchrist. I think we could call him a philosopher these days.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think he's quite brilliant, and I'm enjoying his, especially his two volume Master and Emissary is more physiology, but this
Hmm.
latest one is more of philosophy.
Yeah, the matter with things. Yeah,
Yeah,
we had a great discussion. Maybe you could.
yeah, I bet he's lovely. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. What is the purpose, if any, of human existence?
Mm. Well, I mean, I guess my first response is to discover ourselves, and evolve ourselves.
Hmm. Okay, excellent. Well, thank you, Terry. That's those are all the rapid fire questions I have for you.
Oh, yeah.
Uh, but yeah,
Yeah, what fun! I think that you've innovated a really fun way of wrapping up the interview.
well, thank you so much, Terry. And
You're
I'm gonna,
welcome.
yeah, yeah. Thank you so much again for joining me here today and taking the time and sharing all the knowledge and wisdom that you have.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation, and it's an honor to be here with you.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, you take care.